All right, so here's a great graphic of Tetris to kind of sum up, encapsulate in an image what this article is all about. What I'm going to do here is go through those strategies I just covered on the last slide and take this article and basically just do each one of them, give you some examples so that you can see how you do that on your own. And then, as I mentioned before, you'll take the other two articles I've assigned as required reading for lesson 2 and use those strategies as you read them and come up with a pretty good discussion board post where you explain what you've learned by doing some critical reading of those other two articles. And so hopefully this piece of the lecture will be helpful to doing that discussion board post, but moreover, hopefully it'll help you with all kinds of things you have to read for other classes and other reasons. I chose this article because I like to play video games and board games and all kinds of stupid games, as Anderson calls them. But I think most people like to play games of some sort. Even if you're not a big video gamer or you never break out a board game or a card game, I think in some realm of our lives, we all play some type of game, which is in a way what this article is really about. So I hope it speaks to you in that sense and it's an enjoyable read. The first time I read it, I really found it engaging and interesting. I hope you do too. And then the other two articles are speaking more to each other than they are in conversation with this particular article, but they all have to do with technology and how modern use of technology affects our lives. This isn't a major theme for the class, but I thought it would be good to have all articles themed around basically the same topic for this critical reading lesson, just to kind of make that critical reading process you're learning in this lesson flow a little more smoothly. But let's go in and take a look at Anderson's Just One More Game. So if you recall from part 1 of the lecture, the first two strategies I went over were adjusting your reading speed and then annotating while you read. I can't really demonstrate those on a PowerPoint because they were things I did actually while I read the article. So we're going to start with step 3, which was summarizing what you've read in your own words, because if you put it in your own words instead of just quoting, you demonstrate your knowledge, your understanding of it. I want to say real quickly, those first two strategies, even though we're not putting them on a slide here, are very important. Everything you see on the next slides would not be possible if I had not read Anderson's article slowly and if I had not made notes while I read it. So what I'm going to do here to show summary is I'm going to first put up 2 quotes I pulled from the article that are, I think, really fundamental quotes that really kind of sum up his main argument. And then I'm going to then rephrase those quotes in my own words. So the first one is, today we are living for better and worse in a world of stupid games. I think this is a quote, if you've read the article, probably, sums up the whole article. Here's my citation of it. I wanted to take a quick sentence and a second and demonstrate proper citation, since you'll need to do proper citation in the papers you write for this class. So this is what we call a web article. It's only available online. And what's really cool about it is there's certain parts of it that are visual and interactive, where you can, this is an article that the subject matter obviously is aided greatly by having those visuals there. But some of them are interactive. If I remember correctly, you can even play like a video game on there, like a little one, which, really illustrates his topic and his idea. But there's no page numbers to the point about illustration. And so here I cite the paragraph 3, abbreviating the word paragraph for space, which is what you want to do when you write a paper, and then emphasis added. I thought he seems, in my opinion, to focus more on the negative than the positive, though he certainly loves stupid games. And so for better and worse, and because he's doing kind of a pun, we usually say for better or worse, but in this article he's really showing the positives and the negatives more so, but both. And so by choosing to emphasize that word end, I feel like quoting it this way, I'm conveying something important about the article. But because it wasn't originally italicized, I needed to identify that. So I say emphasis added. If it had been italicized in the original, I would say emphasis in original, so that whoever's reading my paper would know whether the italics come from me or from the original author. And then I just want to say real quickly, as I mentioned a minute ago, the article is this cool web article, which those are becoming more popular. We're going to read a number of those this quarter. I love the way the visuals engage the audience, and I'm also going to ask you to include visuals, though not as extensively in the papers you write. And so even with this first article, we're already doing some of the visual critical reading, not just the written word critical reading that I mentioned. And this is just kind of a first glance at it. And I address the written word more so in this paper or this lecture, since it's our first foray into critical reading. But I think Anderson's article really illustrates, pun intended, how you can read things critically that are not just written words, but also visuals. Second quote I pulled is, maybe that's the secret genius of stupid games. They force us to make a series of interesting choices about what matters moment to moment in our lives. So since he shows the positives and negatives, he doesn't have a clear stance. It's not an article that says stupid games are good or stupid games are bad. So if I wanted to sum up his thesis in one sentence, I think I look to a sentence like this, where he's saying there's good things, there's bad things about them, but ultimately what's important about them is they force us to think about what matters. They kind of lead us to identifying our values, you could say. And that's what makes something that seems stupid really important. So here's how I would sum that up in my own words. Stupid games have become ubiquitous in our culture and have both positive and negative effects on our lives. So if someone asked me in one sentence to tell you what Anderson's article is about, this is how I would do it. And the word ubiquitous just means they're everywhere. Like I said at the start of this part of the lecture, even if you're not a big-time gamer, all of us play some kind of stupid game in one way or another, so they're ubiquitous. And this is the goal with summary. If you want to have read something critically and understood it fully, you can tell someone after you've read it in one sentence, in your own words, what the main point of it is. So moving on from summary, following the strategies I outlined on the previous part of the lecture, we're going to start analyzing the article. And the first step there, like I said before, is to identify the different parts of the rhetorical situation, so we know what Anderson was doing and why, and what context, and how he used rhetoric. So the purpose is to make readers aware of stupid games and their effects. The audience is people who play stupid games. To go back to the point about the ubiquity of stupid games, his audience is really anyone. He's writing to a very general audience here, not a really specific group of people. Almost anyone, I think, could understand what he's saying and maybe even relate in some way, which is another reason why I picked this piece for our example. The genre is a print article or a web article. So I think this was actually printed in the New York Times, but there's the web version of it with the graphics I talked about earlier. That's important, right? Because if this were only available as a print article, I don't think his argument would be as effective. I think if you're writing about games, having visuals there is a crucial part of it. And so we only talked about genre a little bit in lesson one, but here I think is a good example of how choosing the genre in which to produce your text is a really important part of understanding the rhetorical situation. What is his stance? Like I said on the last slide, his thesis in our own words is basically stupid games have both positive and negative effects, leaning toward more negatives than positives, but he does identify some positives. And finally, what is the media or design? So it's both print and digital, with illustrations and even a simulation of a game. So we've already pointed this out, But I just want to say, in terms of looking at the different aspects of the rhetorical situation, how a text looks, even if it's a written word, is important, right? Like some things you've read were probably easier to read, or you were more willing to read them because of just how the text looked. And I think anymore in this day and age, to compose compelling, engaging text, we need to incorporate more visual elements. And so that's why that's a part of this class as well. So here are like the 5 pieces you want to think about when you think about a rhetorical situation: purpose, audience, genre, stance, media, and design. Now, we could go into more depth and detail here by looking at how he uses ethos or credibility, pathos or emotion, logos or logical reasoning, and kairos or timeliness. But that's basically going to play out over the next few slides. So I wanted to devote one slide just to these basic, or you could say fundamental aspects of the rhetorical situation itself. But as we start to analyze his use of rhetoric, let's move on to the next step from those strategies, which was identifying patterns. What recurs throughout the text more than once that can help us get a better understanding of its meaning and purpose? So one of the types of patterns you usually see are key concepts. What is an idea that comes up over and over again? For Anderson, one idea that comes up over and over again when talking about stupid games is that they reflect their culture of origin. So games tell us something about the time period they come from. For instance, Monopoly came out in the 1930s when the country was going through a time of economic depression, which is just a really interesting fact, to pick up from this article. But another example would be the game Risk, the game of global conquest where you have armies that conquer different countries, came out during the Cold War when the U.S. was locked into this ideological battle with Russia and other communist parts of the world, but didn't explode into outright conflict with the exceptions of the Vietnam and Korean Wars. And so you had players play this game of world domination, kind of playing out probably their emotions that were wrapped up in being in an ideological but cold conflict. And this really underscores this point that even though these games are stupid in the way he kind of uses that term in more than one way, but very important. One way they're important is they're reflective of their culture. So this is a concept that comes up multiple times. And I think, games like Angry Birds and Fruit Ninja and all these merge games and Candy Crush that are popular right now reflect our culture in the early 21st century. Another one is that stupid games intrude on parts of our lives because of the convenient medium of the smartphone. So you used to have to go to greater lengths to play what we would call stupid games. And so now it's much easier. And so this is a really important part of his article because it shows how games just become more of a part of our lives now because they're so easily accessible. So one type of pattern to identify is ideas that come up multiple times. But another one is key words. So not just a whole idea, but just a word. 1 or 2 words, maybe a phrase that's repeated. And so what were some of them from Anderson's article? One is the term stupid game itself, which is really important because when we think of the word stupid, he's not using it in the way we typically think of the word, for instance, saying like this is dumb. He's calling it stupid because it mainly has repetitive and addictive actions. Those 2 words are important. So you're doing the same thing over and over and over again, but you can't stop. And so a game like Risk or even chess, he uses chess, I think, is a good example of stupid meets genius in the same game because it requires, a degree of intelligence and strategy, but you're still playing the same thing over and over again. If you do it multiple times and you want to keep doing it, it's addictive. And so that's really what he means by stupid. And it's stupid, encapsulates this fact that like we this part of his idea that like these games almost seem like a waste of time, or if we step back, we say they're a waste of time, but we can't stop playing. More so than that they're just dumb. So everyone knows what the word stupid means. He is using it in a completely different way here. But it's a very effective, it makes sense. It kind of conveys this sense of this is a waste of time, but I can't really stop. There must be something more to it. It makes us really think about the way he's describing these games by using a word we know well in a little bit different way, but a way that still alludes, in a sense, to the original definition. And so for critical reading, you want to be able to understand the terms the author is using. And sometimes that's a brand new word. Sometimes it's a word just in a different way, like the case with stupid here. So he uses that phrase, I don't know how many times. So it's a pattern throughout the article and absolutely fundamental to understanding its meaning. Another key word is a games for change model, which is how when he's talking about some of the positive effects, not just the negative effects of stupid games, in a sense, they can be a healthy activity for us. And he goes into a little more depth with that in the article. I'm not going to spend too much time on that here, but it'll kind of play out over the next few slides. So we've covered, I think, 3 of the strategies once we get beyond actual reading and more to the reflective part of the process of critical reading. I'm going to cover the other 3 all on one slide here so that we move a little more quickly here for you. So analyzing the article in more depth and detail, analyzing the argument, I should say, and being a part of that is believing and doubting. And I want to take a second here and point out one of the best things to look for when you're analyzing an argument and seeing whether you believe it or you doubt it is looking for other voices. So is Anderson's the only voice in this piece, or does he quote other sources? Thinking back to rhetoric and ethos, which we use to build our credibility and appeal to the audience's sense of credibility, the audience's desire to see us as an authority when we write and they read our work, we have to bring in other voices. We have to cite other authorities to build our own authority and credibility. And I think, Anderson does an excellent job of this. One of the other voices he brings in is MHohner, who says play is possibly the best, healthiest, most productive activity a human can undertake. So going right off of the last slide on that key word, games for change, these games seem stupid or a waste of time, but humans have to play. All work and no play makes one dull person. So games give us a chance to play. So this outside authority reinforces what Anderson argues is one of the positives of stupid games. He also talks about addiction and corporate use, so kind of going to the negative side of things. So he gives his argument balance. It's not just all one-sided. He loves stupid games, which is why he wrote the piece, but it's not all positive because he doesn't want his argument to be biased. So in terms of believing and doubting, you have to bring in other voices to make your argument convincing. You also have to bring in other opinions to make your argument convincing. If you only show one side of the argument, your audience will just think you're biased, and they'll think it's just your opinion rather than a well-reasoned, well-argued thesis. Another voice he brings in is Lance, who says it's hard to design a good game, so we don't need to worry. In other words, if addiction and corporate use are things that are concerning, Lance is saying it can be hard to make a really good game, so we maybe don't have to worry as much about these negative things. But what he's doing here is, in showing the other side of the argument, showing the negative effects, he's also quoting a source to support that. So not only does he bring in other voices to reinforce his credibility and his authority when he's talking about the positives of stupid games, he also does that when he's talking about the negatives of stupid games. So those are some examples of how other voices can help an argument stronger, and an example of us analyzing the argument and playing the believing and doubting game. He's got McGonagall to show the believing and Lance to show the doubting, and that can help us maybe accept his argument more because it's a more well-rounded argument. So let's move on to the last strategy from the previous slide, which was considering the larger context. What were maybe the influences on Anderson, and how does this piece speak to the world in which we live in 2022? So one piece of this article that I think makes it really relevant is the concept gamification, which is corporations using gameplay to hook consumers. So if you've played games on a smartphone, and I've played so many games on my smartphone where I felt like I was doing the same thing over and over again, but I couldn't stop, really understand what he's saying about the repetitive, addictive nature of stupid games. But you'll notice how there's ads, there's other strategies to maybe get people to buy things. So gamification is essentially, in terms of maybe a key word here, taking stupid games and corporations using ways to make money. But this really speaks to the cultural moment, because to go back to one of his earlier points, that these games intrude on our lives because they're on our phones and in other ways easy to access. So if we have stupid games, which have been around since the beginning of time, he says at one point, and gives some examples. They've been around since the beginning of time. They're now easier to access and use than ever before, so much so they intrude on our lives. Thirdly, companies are finding ways to turn them into, to commodify them, to turn them into ways to make money. All of a sudden, this article becomes really relevant to our lives and gives us something important to think about. So, the larger context, which is kind of the last step in critical reading. And this is obviously one of the potential negative effects. Remember, I've said all throughout he's discussing the positives and the negatives and not really landing on one definitive one. Even though he loves stupid games, he seems very worried. And so not landing on one particular thesis, kind of having both, is kind of an issue. I'll talk about that more on the next slide. I want to provide one last slide here before we close out to kind of sum everything up. And so this is I started with a one-sentence statement of what the article is about. This is more of like a paragraph statement, which if you're doing a really thorough critical reading, you don't have to do this every time you critically read something, but to be able to say in one sentence what the article is about is kind of the first level summary, but be able to go into more detail and say, this is what the article is about, but now I've thoroughly analyzed it. This is why I agree or I disagree. That shows you've really not just understood it, but you've done a thorough investigation of it. So here's my conclusion about Anderson's piece. Anderson gives an overview of stupid games. These are games that have been around a long time, but most recently can be found in examples such as Tetris and Angry Birds, where players become addicted to completing the same repetitive actions over and over again. Anderson aims to make readers aware of both the positive and negative effects of playing stupid games by pointing out that this type of gameplay can be a healthy activity, but also one corporations use to take advantage of consumers. Anderson fails to clearly pick a side. He leans more toward the negatives outweighing the positives, but does end by indicating that stupid games play an important role in helping us think through major decisions about how we spend our time. So you see, I start with like a summary. This is what it's about. In terms of his argument, I say he has the positives and the negatives. Then I give a specific example. So a positive, healthy play, a negative, corporations use them. Then I take a stance, I give my opinion. I say he fails to clearly pick a side. And then I end with kind of a summative comment of this is what it's ultimately about, like his message or his meaning. a few really important quick notes here before we close out the lecture. I think him failing to pick a side is intentional. He wants to more tell us this is how stupid games affect our lives, kind of make us aware. And he, I think, himself has a hard time choosing because he loves stupid games, but he sees the concerns. So I think his purpose doesn't necessarily lead him to a definitive stance. He doesn't say whether the pros outweigh the cons or vice versa. In certain rhetorical situations like this one for the New York Times, I think that works. Me personally, as a reader, I prefer a stronger stance, which is why I include this as my conclusion here. But I think, again, certain rhetorical situations like this one for the New York Times, where he's trying to do something specific, that can work. I think he's ultimately successful in his goal because of what his goal was, even if me personally as a reader, I would have preferred a little bit different goal. For papers for this class, you'll definitely want to have a really clear thesis from which you don't deviate. Now, you need to introduce the other side to give yourself credibility, like I talked about on the last slide, but then you want to reaffirm your stance. You want to respond to those objections. Again, that's because of the rhetorical situation of this class where you're learning to write persuasively so that you do well in your classes in college. In other rhetorical situations, you don't necessarily need to have as firm of a stance, but those would be rhetorical situations outside of this class, like the one in which Anderson was writing. Finally, I think he makes this really important comment about they help us think through major decisions about how we spend our time. Again, he's not very definitive here. How much time is too much? I don't think he says, because I think it's fairly subjective, and he doesn't want to be super prescriptive here, coming back to his goal. But if I were to levy one critique against this article, which I really enjoyed, I would say he could have developed this idea in more detail. I think this is one of the most interesting ideas. And even if he's not prescriptive about how much time we spend, this is where you really see how this article is important and where you really get a clear argument, because it's not positive or negative. It's this is why they're important. They reveal something to us. So it's just an idea. To me, it's the best idea in the article. So I would have wanted to see him do more with it. But those are my conclusions. You see, I've clearly, critically read this piece. Hopefully it illustrates to you how to do critical reading. Hopefully it'll be useful to you in other classes, but mainly now you can go and do the discussion board post and do this kind of work with those other two articles. And part of that is I'm actually going to ask you to compare the two articles because they're kind of taking two sides of a topic. So hopefully that'll be an engaging discussion board. I look forward to reading your posts because I think this is fascinating stuff, and more so, I'm looking forward to reading more of your writing. But hopefully it'll be an insightful introduction to how to do one of the most fundamental things for success in college and effective communication.